Hello, my name is Liz Kelly and I'm the Grant Specialist with the Minnesota Department of Veteran Affairs. This presentation is the last part, Part 4, of a 4-part series called Reporting Grant Expenditures. In Parts 1 through 3, we reviewed grantee resources, the MDVA website, the grant manual, we looked at a grant agreement, and then we went on to look at forms and spreadsheets that are used by the grantee to report grant expenditures. In this final presentation, we will look at examples so that by the end of the presentation, grantees should have a very good idea of what they need to do to report their grant expenditures and get paid. To report your grant expenditures to the state, the work that you need to do beforehand can be broken down into a couple steps. The first step is gathering your supporting documentation. And again, what that means is your invoices, your cash receipts, your service contracts, and your payroll records. Credit card receipts are not a substitute for an invoice. For the supporting documentation to be eligible, it must be legible and include the vendor name and itemized description of the product or service, the invoice date or service date range, and the total dollar amount. In the first example of supporting documentation, we're looking at an Office Depot invoice. On the invoice, you can see in the highlighted section that there's a list of the items that were purchased and the amount due. The order date or the invoice date is when the expense was incurred, not the ship date. In the second example, we're looking at a receipt, not an invoice, but the information shown is the same. We have the vendor name of Office Max, we have the receipt date of July 20th, an itemized list of what was purchased, and the receipt amount. In this third example, we see an invoice from the Star Tribune. However, with service contracts, the expense is incurred not on the invoice date, but during the date range when the service was provided. In this case, it was August to November 2015. One final note about supporting documentation. Be sure you copy the original invoice or receipt. Credit card receipts are not substitutes. Be sure that the expense is allowed per the grant agreement and that it was incurred within the grant period. The second step, once you've gathered all your invoices, receipts, and service contracts, is to itemize those invoices on the budget expenditure spreadsheet. Budget expenditure spreadsheets will vary from grantee to grantee depending on the complexity of the grant, but they will all include the original budget that was approved back when the grant agreement was first executed, and then a list of all the expenditures that were made when the grantee is getting ready to submit a request for payment or they are reporting their expenditures from money previously advanced in an advance payment grant. In this example, Table 1 shows the grantee's original budget. At the beginning of the grant period, when a grantee creates a budget, the budget is pretty generic. There are categories like equipment, advertising, travel, so on. But when it's time to report expenditures, grantees need to break out individual invoices by individual vendors. There are a couple ways for grantees to handle itemizing individual invoices. One is to expand the budget expenditure spreadsheet to reflect different vendors within a budget item. So in this example, the original budget for advertising was $15,000. However, this grantee will be using two vendors for advertising, the Star Tribune and the Pioneer Press. So in this example, the budget expenditure spreadsheet is expanded to list the separate vendors. So if you look at the operations area in orange, you will see two line items under advertising, one for the Star Tribune for $4,016 and the other for the Pioneer Press for $1,080. However, if a grantee is, say, using 10 vendors for advertising, then trying to expand the budget expenditure spreadsheet just for advertising to 10 lines starts to get pretty cumbersome. So an alternative way of reporting the individual invoices is to do it on a separate list. Here's an example of a list of the advertising expenditures. We have the category of advertising. The grantee is showing the service date range because not the invoice, but the service date range is when the expense is incurred. The list is showing the vendor, the product or service that was provided, and the invoice amount. So when a grantee uses a separate spreadsheet or Word document to itemize individual invoices within a budget item like advertising, then what is filled in on the budget expenditure spreadsheet, then there'll just be one line, and it will just say advertising. Maybe in parentheses it might say see attached itemized list, and then the dollar amount will be the total from the itemized list that we just looked at, which was a little over $11,000. Now, I've mentioned that on the budget expenditure spreadsheet that invoices are listed separately. However, there are a couple exceptions. One is when you have multiple invoices with the same vendor for the same product, and the other is for travel. Here are some examples of what we just talked about. In this slide, multiple invoices for the Star Tribune for the same service, advertising, are added together for a total of $4,016. For travel-related expenses, the grantee will list the grand total from the travel log. The reason this is okay is that individual travel-related expenses are listed separately on the travel log, as we'll see in a minute. You may remember this example of a travel log from part 2 of this presentation. The total amount in the lower right-hand column for travel was $1,493. That is the amount that will be recorded on the budget expenditure spreadsheet. So going back to the budget expenditure spreadsheet, you can see in the highlighted yellow row that travel is listed on one line for the total on the travel log of $1,493. The third step is to complete the forms. The payment request form is completed last because it's not until you've gathered all of your supporting documentation, your invoices and receipts, and itemized all your eligible expenditures on the budget expenditure spreadsheet that you know how much you're going to be either requesting for reimbursement or reporting that you have spent. As you can see here, the total grant expenditures for Q2 was $15,781.40. This is the amount that you are requesting if your grant is reimbursement based, or the amount that you are reporting if your grant is advance payment. One last point. The period for which the grant funds are requested is the date range of your grant expenditures. List the earliest invoice date and the latest invoice date. The payment request form then becomes page 1 of your payment request submitted to the state. So in conclusion, the first piece of paper that you will be submitting is the reimbursement payment request form or advance payment report form. That's your cover page. The next is the budget expenditure spreadsheet, followed by all the logs that apply to your grant. Very often it will include a travel log, and then occasionally a gift certificate log, a contract and bidding log, or so on. Then last are all the invoices, cash receipts, service contracts, and so on that support the itemized expenditures that you've listed on the budget expenditure spreadsheet. Now you're ready to submit your payment request or your payment report. First, number all the pages. MDVA's preferred method of receiving this documentation is electronically via email. So the best way to do this is to scan all the pages in one PDF file. Drag the PDF file into an email, and additionally, any of the documents that are in Excel format should be dragged and dropped into the same email so that they are received at MDVA in Excel format. It's okay if you scanned them, but the whole purpose of using Excel is to take advantage of the formulas. One final note, if you are unable to transmit your documentation electronically, sending it by mail is an authorized alternative. Thank you for listening to this presentation. If you have any questions or suggestions about how to improve the presentation, please don't hesitate to contact me, and good luck with your grant.